No, I can't remember what I was doing last week.
Okay, fine. So I'll probably recap a little bit of what the main points from last week anyway. Okay, we're live now. Great. So let's go. Have you allowed me to share screen? You have. Okay, good. Thank you. So you want to introduce Rabbi, or should I just go straight and jump straight in?
I'm just going to introduce you very briefly that I'm delighted. That's why I wait, because there's always a gap in YouTube. 1 second. Okay, good evening, everyone, and I want to welcome and thank Rabbi Daniel Gigi for returning for his second installment of the Waters of Eden. Last week, I think we had some lived experience of what it is to lean into suffering and lean into emotion. And this evening, we continue with that path of exploring some of the amazing texts that we have and the deep mystical components that they offer, alongside some very practical, bringing that all the way from the theory into practice of how to take those concepts and make them a part of our spiritual life right here, right now. Rabbi Gigi is, in addition to being a close personal friend and mentor, also the founder and leader of Mayan Khatum, the Center for Contemplative Judaism, and we are delighted that you're here tonight. So thank you, Rabbi Gigi, for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks so much for the introduction. Again, I think I'm humbled by your introductions, as usual. So, but I'm really glad to be able to do it with you. Yeah, you're very lucky to have a good rabbi. Such a great rabbi. He is a really wonderful rabbi. Okay, so I'm going to start by I want to talk about mindful Judaism. What is mindful Judaism? I'm going to share a screen with you that we started last week. Can you see that? You know, so can you what can you see? You can see just the PowerPoint presentation.
We can see the PowerPoint around it as well, so we can't just see the slide.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just going to go onto the slide then. I'm going to. Okay.
Perfect.
You can see it. Great. Okay. So let's see. 1 second. Okay. So I want to start by going over the definition of mindful contemplative Judaism, which I began last week. The purpose of mindful Judaism is to bring us into contact with our divine origin through the medium of 3 seats of the soul and 3 gates of practice. The 3 gates correspond to the 3 pillars upon which the universe stands. So according to the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, which some of us have been reading, the universe depends on 3 things: the study of Torah, the temple service, and acts of loving kindness. These pillars are the purpose of God's creation of the universe. In contemplative Judaism, these pillars translate to 3 practices or orientations: mindfulness and contemplation, which in Hebrew is known as hitbonanut; concentration and devotion or heartfulness, which in Hebrew is known as hitbodedut. Hitbodedut literally means to be alone, but it's used as a synonym for concentration and meditation. And the third one is right intention and right attitude, or what I like to call posture or gutfulness, which in Hebrew is known as kavanah. These are the 3 gates of mindful Judaism, and they correspond to 3 seats of the soul. The Talmud tells us that the soul contains 5 parts, and according to the Kabbalah, 3 are internal and reside within the brain, the heart, and the blood or the liver. So why there is a difference between blood and liver, because the liver contains blood. It's got a lot of blood. So that's why. So it's really the blood. The remaining 2 encompass the body as a surrounding kind of aura. It is through these parts of the soul that we come into contact with God. The Torah, in describing the creation of man, says that God breathed into Adam's nostrils the breath of life. In other words, our inhalation is God's exhalation. Right? Think of it in that way, because he breathed into Adam's nostrils the breath of life. Therefore, the first Rebbe of Chabad says that the soul is a veritable fragment of God. It's a famous expression. I can tell you where it is. It's a really, really amazing text, that one. So the subject of this series is the gate of gutfulness. But just like a table needs at least 3 legs to be stable, these 3 gates depend on each other. Mindfulness means awareness, observation, and attentiveness. It denotes the practice of bringing attention to your present moment experience, whether it be sensory, social, or emotional and abstract thinking. Whatever can be an object of awareness can be an object for mindfulness practice. Being in the present moment is zooming in, but in a contemplative mode, mindfulness also means zooming out, looking at the big picture, the wholeness of life and the universe. But I have found that mindfulness alone can have a sense of coldness and coolness. It can disconnect you from feeling. I've seen this with people who are doing mindfulness from a secular perspective. And it can lead to emotional numbness and avoidance. So therefore, within mindfulness, we need something. In addition to mindfulness, we need something else. This is heartfulness. Heartfulness is deep intimacy with life. Heartfulness brings warmth and connection to the experience. It is loving prayer, devotional attention, readiness, and enthusiasm. Its main outlet is in the prayer experience, whether that be praise and devotion to God, gratitude, or prayers for and bestowing blessings on loved ones. It is the immanence of God's presence versus the transcendence of God we may experience in mindfulness. These 2 gates are a general summary of religious experience, study and prayer, which constitute the bulk of religious activity. But they both depend on the 3rd gate, gutfulness. Gutfulness means courage. As in the expression found frequently in scripture, be strong and courageous. It is an act of faith, and it is also trusting one's intuition. At the crossing of the Red Sea, the people, faced with the sea on one side and Pharaoh's army on the other, cry to Moses to help them. Moses calls out to them and God responds, "Why do you call out to me? Tell the people that they should go." God is telling Moses, now is not the time for prayer. Now is the time to act in faith and venture forth into the sea. Moses then says to the people, "Do not fear, stand fast and see, God shall wage war for you, and you shall remain silent." The rabbis tell us the people courageously thrust themselves into the sea, not out of desperation, but out of faith. And only then God splits the sea for them. It is an act of faith that ultimately opens us to the goal of mindful Judaism and a return to Eden. So how do we practice gutfulness? To discuss gutfulness, I'm going to move on to the next slide. To discuss gutfulness, I want to look at Abraham Maimonides. Abraham Maimonides, 1186 to 1237, was the only surviving child of Moses Maimonides, the Rambam, born to the latter at the age of 51. It is said that before his passing, the Rambam said that the only person who understood him was his son. Abraham succeeded his father, both as the leader of the Jewish community and as the personal physician to the Sultan. He received the title of Nagid, leader of the Jews, which was passed on to his descendants for generations. The period of his and his father's life saw the growth of mystical brotherhoods within Islam, the Sufis, which gained particular popularity in Egypt. The Jews of the period were influenced by this movement, and a Jewish brotherhood of Sufis was formed. Soon after, Abraham was approached to become their leader, and he accepted. Another leadership role that would be transmitted to his descendants for generations. I think there were about 5 generations of Jewish Sufi leaders in the period in that period. Next slide.
Sorry, can I ask you a question?
Yeah,
Who are the Sufis?
So have you heard of the Sufis?
No, I thought, well, I have, but I can't remember in what context. And I thought it was not in a Jewish context.
Yeah. So, good question, thank you. And if anyone wants to ask a question, please just ask a question. You can either ask it out loud, or you can write a message on the side. So the Sufis there's actually different opinions of it. There is one scholar who says that the Sufis predated Islam, and they were a mystical brotherhood that predated Islam. But I think most scholars say that it's the mystical branch of Islam. Abraham Maimonides, he says that the Sufis retained a tradition from the prophets of the Bible, and they had certain traditions, and he kind of demonstrates that with textual proofs showing how they wore the same clothing. So it's possible that they studied or had some kind of influence from the Jewish, from the prophets, but they were a group of they were from outside.
So does he have a link to them?
So he doesn't have a link to them directly, but it kind of influenced. So so if you think about it, I don't know if you know how much about medieval period, but it was it's called the golden age, and I guess the golden age. I'm not sure if it's called the golden age of Islam, but it was a period where the kind of the wellsprings of information was overflowing. There was the Library of Alexandria, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, there, and the Islamic philosophers they studied all the Greek philosophy. There was a lot of kind of philosophy that was going around at the time. All the information. The Rambam, from my understanding, was said to have read every book. He was said to have kind of said that he read every book that there was in existence at the time. So I don't know whether I'm pretty sure that I'm not 100% sure if the Library of Alexandria was still there, but he was there in Egypt. So if it was, he would have been talking about that library. And so for example, a lot of the early, so he studied mathematics. He studied so algebra is an Arabic word. I don't know if you're familiar with that. I don't know what it means, but algebra is an Arabic word. So a lot of these philosophers were Muslim, and actually a lot of them were Sufis. So the Rambam, he would have studied Al-Ghazali, who was a prominent philosopher at the time. There was a few other ones. You can look it up. I recommend it too. So and they were Sufis. So Judaism, we have a mystical pathway. They didn't call themselves Sufis. They called themselves Hasidim. So the word Hasid, just like the Hasidim of the Baal Shem Tov. But they call themselves that. So that was their path. So if you see here in front of us, this is the path that he wrote about. Does that answer your question? Do you want to? Is there? Yeah. Okay. So it's an interesting period. It's an interesting topic, and I think it's one of these kind of ecumenical kind of, what's it called, interfaith favorites. So if you're in interfaith, people in interfaith know about Abraham Maimonides and the Jewish Sufis, but they were Hasidim. They call themselves Hasidim. Okay, so where have I got to? Right. So the Jews of the period, they were influenced by this movement, and a Jewish brotherhood of Sufis or Hasidim was formed. Soon after, Abraham was approached. So he was the leader of the community at the time. He was approached and became their leader. He was asked to become their leader, and he accepted. And this leadership role would be transmitted to his descendants again for generations. And there would be a few people. I think his son wrote a book on the Jewish Sufi path, Jewish mystical path. And there's actually some interesting Geniza fragments written to his 5th generation descendant about a wife whose husband had run off with the Sufis, and she sends a letter to the fifth generation descendant of Maimonides, saying, "How can I get my husband back?" But we don't have we have the letter, but we don't have the response to the letter, which is really interesting. But it's a side point, that one. But it just shows that this was around for hundreds of years until eventually it became incorporated within Kabbalah, and everything kind of merged into one kind of spiritual path. But he wrote, so Abraham Maimonides wrote a treatise on Jewish Sufism, following the traditional Sufi model of the spiritual path, what is called the tariqah, along this path, the spiritual aspirant progresses through various stations known as maqamat, stations, culminating finally in union with God. Each school has its own station, and even within the Maimonides school, there were a number of different paths. So one of his descendants, the descendant I just mentioned, who had the letter sent to him, he follows a path which is actually in the Gemara. But in his book, Abraham defines a tenfold path, which we see on the slide here now. There's a zero there because he says that before anything, you have to have sincerity. So the path is compassion, sincerity, compassion, generosity, patience, humility, faith, contentedness, abstinence, zeal, devotion, and solitude and retreat. So for Abraham, this is a logical route whereby each station prepares the way to the next. We see here that faith is the fifth station, with humility preceding it and contentedness or equanimity following on from it. So for Abraham, a prerequisite for faith is humility, the knowledge and acknowledgement of our limitations, for which mindfulness is actually a big help. And on the back of faith is contentedness, whereas the Mishnah asks, who is wealthy? And answers, whomever is happy with their lot. So this is kind of a key idea here, that each one of these stages prepares the way for the next one. And so contentedness, that's kind of what we're aiming for in some ways, or at least that's kind of the purpose of this series, to take us to a place of contentedness, and faith is that medium towards that. But again, that begins with humility, and humility is mindfulness, like I said, knowledge and acknowledgement of our limitations. And move on to the next slide. So this book that he written, this treatise that he wrote, he is subdivided into these chapters. So there's a chapter on each one of these stations, and I want to summarize for you some elements of the chapters on the chapter on faith. So Abraham explains in his chapter on faith that it pertains to 10 situations, which break down to 2 types of needs: avoiding loss and gaining benefits. He defines faith as the belief that God exerts complete providence over creation and that no occurrence happens without his providence. He says, this is a quote from him, I haven't put it up on a slide, sorry. But he says, the essence of faith consists in the affirmation of the belief that God is the creator and the provider, and he that causes life and death, and he that makes sick and heals, and he that makes rich and poor. And all the happenings of the world, general as well as particular, revert to him. And he is the author thereof, who decrees and executes them. So this is a summary of what he means by faith. And again, faith is not. It is quite an understanding of the extent to which he says that God has providence over the world. So this is not a simple matter. Faith is not, in the scripture, in the commentators, it's not a simple, idea. You have to define it. You have to understand what it means by faith. And so this definition of faith is really quite kind of, it goes to the particular. The way he says that from the general to the particular, everything reverts to God. So everything that happens in your life, according to Abraham Maimonides' definition of faith, everything comes from God, with the exception of matters of obedience and disobedience. And this is a quote from the Talmud, which says everything is in the hands of heaven apart from the fear of heaven. So, and again, so what is fear of heaven? It's not the topic for today, but that is the caveat of free will in that sense. But this is his definition of faith. And he says that faith applies to 10 situations, 10 situations, but really they break down to two types of needs: the avoidance of loss and the gaining of benefits. He further defines 4 grades of the faithful: the hopeful, those who hope in God's salvation but are fearful on account of their sins. The seeker, those who in addition to hope pray with their hearts and mouths. Number 3, the trusting, those who on account of their sinlessness or on account of a scriptural or prophetic promise, trust with certainty in God's salvation with no fear. So number 3 is actually a kind of a hard one to come by, because you have to either know for a fact that you have no sins, so that requires this level of self-knowledge, which is beyond probably everybody, and or it depends on like, for example, with that quote like we looked at from the Bible, which says God says to go. God tell the people to go. There's a direct commandment from God to go. So you can trust in that. And so therefore you can run into the sea with no fear because you have a divine promise. But again, this is a hard one to come by. And he goes into great details about how it's applicable and whether it's applicable to us and in what circumstances. And okay, the 4th one is commitment, the committed, those who commit all their actions to God and have no regard for the outcome, whether to their benefit or their detriment, and who place complete trust in God's judgment. This is a hard one. This is the hardest one, but and it is what he says about it. So he says the first 2 are incumbent on all, everyone, every Jewish person, or every human being actually. You're incumbent on the first one. So you have hope in God. You believe that statement of faith that I said earlier, but you can still have fear. Fear is still part of that. And if you add prayer to that, then that's the second category. So everyone is obligated within those 2 degrees of faith. But that's not why I'm here, because I think that the other degrees of faith are actually where you can find something much, where the contentedness that he's speaking about comes from. The third path, the third grade, he calls an elevated path. But that depends on circumstances. Like I said, it requires you to know yourself, or requires a scriptural promise. And the 4th is the most elevated of the grades. And is out of the last grade of faith and the 10 situations, we can construct 4 elevated practices, 4 quote elevated practices of faith, which connect with the 4 rivers out of Eden, which I mentioned last week, as well as the 10 commandments. So we may or may not have time to look at the 10 commandments today, but we'll do that next week. We'll have a look at it next week. Not next week, in 2 weeks' time, sorry. So let's move on to the next slide. If you have any questions on this, please just go ahead.
Just wondering, Rabbi Gigi, what the feeling of this faith is like. How does it, if we were talking about gutfulness, for example, what's the embodied sense of that? So, I mean, we're going to go into that. I'm going to go into that afterwards. When we speak about the 4 rivers, that's what I'll talk about. So, if that question, let me hold that question. It's obviously a good question. So, if you let's see if I answer it in the next half an hour, and if not, then call me up on that one. Okay. So, right. So the next one. What are the 4 aspects of faith? So the number 4 is a central theme within Judaism. 4 rivers out of Eden, 4 trees of the garden, 4 letters of the divine name, 4 universes of the Kabbalah, 4 husks which obscure the divine reality beneath. These 4 correspond to 4 fundamental practices or modes of faith and acceptance. The 10 situations, like I said, break down into 2 types of needs, losing and gaining. But as Abraham said, the ultimate grade of faith disregards both loss and gain. The 4 rivers are an enactment of this final grade. So in discussing the 4 rivers, we'll rely on the interpretation of the medieval commentator Rashi, Shlomo Yitzchaki, and he commented that he's probably the most famous of all commentators. He commented on everything. And we'll look at the 19th century Hasidic Rebbe, Mordechai Yosef Leiner of Ishbitsa.
So let me go to the quote we've got in front of us now. The Torah says, "A river issues forth from Eden to water the garden. And it then divides and becomes 4 branches, 4 headwaters. The name of the first is Pishon, the one that winds through the whole land of Havilah, where the gold is. The name of the second is Gihon, the one that winds through the whole land of Cush. The name of the third river is Tigris, or Hidekel in Hebrew, the one that flows east of Ashur, which is Assyria. Ashur is Assyria. And the fourth river is the Euphrates, or in Hebrew, Perat." So commenting on the rivers, so there are 4. So we'll look at the commentaries of Rashi and Mordechai Yosef. So Rashi says Pishon. Rashi says this is the Nile, whose waters are expansive. In Hebrew, pashu is expansive. Lehit pashet means to expand or to expand outwards. So that is the meaning of the word Pishon. And the next one, Gihon, Rashi inverts. So in interpreting this, Rashi inverts the letters. So instead of Gihon, it's Nagach. It becomes Nagach, and Nagach means to roar, right? And another word. So there's another word called, which is Genicha in Hebrew, and that means groan, or in Yiddish, kvetch, right? So Gihon is connected to kvetching. Right, moaning, groaning. It's a practice. Rabbi Nachman of Breslev talks about it as a practice that you should do. Although there is another Rebbe who says you shouldn't do it on Shabbat because we don't kvetch on Shabbat. Anyway, the third one is Hidekel, which is the Tigris. But Rashi. So what Rashi does, he splits the word in 2. Chad vekal. So Hidekel, he separates it as into Chad vekal, meaning sharp and light. That's how that's what he talks about it. So the idea is that it's a very fast-running stream, fast-running river. The fourth one is Perat, which is the Euphrates. It's the same kind of word, Perat, Euphrates. Rashi explains this from the expression. So he interprets the using kind of the name, which sounds like Peru Urvu, which means be fruitful and multiply. Right. So this is the idea that the waters are rejuvenating. So he says the waters make one, rejuvenate one. So these are the four rivers. And I said this last week, but there are a lot of people kind of comment on what are these 4 rivers, what they refer to. There's only one reference to it. Ari Kaplan talks about it in his book on the waters of Eden. It's in there. So it's kind of like almost like this is how Judaism works. You find a verse and you see if you can add interpretations to it, levels of interpretation to it. So that's a Rashi, and Rashi is often based on the Midrash. Going to the Ishbitsarabi, Rabbi Mordechai Yosef Leiner, so he connects these rivers to 4 types of person. Pishon, like Rashi, he understands this as an expansiveness, and he connects it to the enlightened person. So the enlightened person in Ishbitzer Hasidism, it's almost like law doesn't apply to him, and whatever he does is an act of God. So all his actions are inherently perfect. There is an alignment there with this person and God's will. So that's kind of how so that is the Pishon, the person who represents Pishon, this river, is that person who can expand, and expansiveness actually, or pashu, or hit pashet in Ishbitzer Hasidism, is a technical term. And it means you can kind of do what you like, because you are so bound up with God and God's will that whatever you do is divine. This is a topic unto itself. Books have been written about it. The next one is Gihon. So this is according to the Ishbitsarabi, this is what he refers to as the superficially righteous, people who appear righteous on the outside, but on the inside they're not righteous. And so this person must endure privation and, so to speak, crawl on his belly. So the word Gihon means belly. So whereas Rashi inverts the word, he uses a permutation of the word, With Mordechai Yosef, he just takes it as it is, which means on the belly. But they connect. They have some kind of connection of when you're crawling on your belly and you're suffering because of that, and so therefore you're groaning as well. So there's a kind of connection between Rashi and Reb Mordechai Yosef. That's my mindfulness bell, if you can hear it. Goes off every hour. Okay, Chidekel is the next one. This is the path of great doubt. So Rashi says that it's light and or sharp and light. So for the Ishbitsarabi, this is a narrow path, and a person must be very careful. A person who walks this path must be very careful not to stray left or right. So he calls this path the path of doubt, path of great doubt. And the final one, Parat, this is the Baal Shiva. Now the Baal Shiva means somebody who sinned or penitent. But it also means returning, and Baal Shem Tov talks about this as the master of returning. So the Baal Tshuva is somebody who is walking in abundance and growth. So he knows that. So he or she knows that they are lacking, and that but when you know you're lacking, you know your limitations, like I said beforehand, that humility that leads into a place of faithfulness, and that leads to a place of growth. You know you're lacking, and therefore you're able to grow from that. So this is their Rashi and the Ishbitsarabi's interpretation of it. But looking at these ideas from the perspective of faith as defined by Abraham Maimonides, 4th grade and 10 situations, we can define 4 practices. So it's connected to Rashi and the Ishbitsarabi, but it's kind of expands more from that. So these 4 practices I have found personally to be some of the best approaches to dealing with life circumstances, and you can test them out for yourself. And I really have found them to be, some of the best things around, which is that, and that's what I wanted to share with you in this series. So move on to the next slide. So these are the 4 rivers. So I put the title of 4 rivers. All right, 4 rivers out of and then back into Eden. So let's have a look at one by one, and we're not going to cover all of them today. We'll do hopefully 3 of them today. We'll do some extra practice at the end of it, and then the 4th one we'll hopefully do next time around. So let's look at Gichon, welcoming suffering. The first practice stems from the Ishbitsarabi's path of the superficially righteous. In order for this person to attain perfection, they must endure great privation, groaning under their burden, as Rashi puts it. Yet, as though following this river back to its source, it is specifically through their suffering that they are able to overcome it. Now, again, this will require a definition of suffering. What is suffering? So we defined faith, according to Abraham Maimonides, as the avoidance of loss and the acquisition of some gain, as in the desire, the need for that. And the highest grade of faith as the complete acceptance of life circumstances, whether they be beneficial or detrimental. Right? So suffering is precisely the opposite of this. Dissatisfaction with what is there and frustration with what is not there. So suffering is defined by these 2 things, like and dislike, what I like and what I dislike. And if we don't accept, if we want something to go away, if we want something that is there to go away, and we are unable to accept its existence there, then we suffer. This is aversion. And when there is something that is not there that we want to be there, we have a craving for something, whatever it might be. And if we are unable to accept that it's not there, then we suffer. So this is the reason why I think it's such a crucial thing for people to understand. So even though it's not incumbent on everybody to reach this 4th grade, I think it's actually beneficial for people to reach this 4th grade, because it really can lead you to a place of contentedness, like he says. So I'm going to give you a scenario to illustrate this. I looked for something in the Gemara that there was a story very similar to this, but I couldn't find it. I even called 3 rabbis, and the only one who responded couldn't find it either. So I'm either mistaken in my memory, or or yeah, there's no one can find it. Anyway, so I'm going to tell you what happened to me. Suffering is to see and accept it without complaint. Let me tell you an anecdote that happened to me last year. So I always keep a bag of sweets in my car, partly because I'm hypoglycemic, but mostly because I have a sweet tooth and I feel guilty about having them at home. So I keep them for the road. It's kind of an excuse that I have. So last year I went to get my car washed and I had them clean the inside. I'd normally do it myself, but my car vacuum had packed up. A few weeks later, I noticed that my sweets were gone. There was a pack of Werther's Originals and a few sticks of polos. They didn't amount to much, but I wasn't too happy about it. And obviously it was too late to complain to the car wash. So the only thing I could do was to leave a bad review. And I was certain it was from the car wash. I thought about how did they disappear. It must have been from the car wash. The only thing I could do was leave a bad review on Google, but I didn't mention the sweets because it would have probably been taken down because it was unsubstantiated. So it might seem strange to feel sorry over a few pounds. Literally, it was like I looked up how much it was afterwards, and just to see how crazy I was being, and it was like £1 for the Werther's Originals and not much different for the polos. So I was sore over a few pounds, but then there's that feeling of being stolen from, and that I think is where it comes from. That's an unpleasant feeling. So I went into my spiritual toolkit to see what I could find, and I found some solace in the Kabbalistic notion of holy sparks. So I don't know if you're familiar with this idea. So according to the Lurianic Kabbalah, which is he was Yitzhak Lurie, he was a 16th century Kabbalist from Israel, from Tzfat. By that point, I think pretty much there was no more of the Jewish Sufi movement. Everything had kind of combined, but they did that group in Tzfat did retain certain elements of the Sufi stories. So Lurianic Kabbalah, according to Lurianic Kabbalah, the universe is composed of vessels containing lights. When God first created the universe, the light of creation was too great for the primordial vessels to receive, and they broke and fell, creating in their wake the 4 universes of the Kabbalah. And also this was the origin of evil. This event was called the shattering of the vessels. Later, God sent forth holy sparks to sustain the broken vessels, and it is our job through right action to extract the sparks and elevate the vessels back to their source. All of creation then is composed of vessels, broken vessels, lights, and sparks. Everything we encounter, including our possessions, contains sparks, but we cannot extract them all. Some of them must be extracted by others. So I don't know if you can see where this is going. So I reflected on the sweets and considered perhaps there were no more sparks for me in them. Perhaps the vessels can only be rectified by others. This is obviously kind of an unknown thing. I'm kind of like playing a game here, but that space, the reflection created allowed me to let them go, to let the sweets go, and also to let them go, to let any hard feelings go as well. I wasn't going to do anything about it. I just let it go, accept the situation, and move on. And then I thought to myself, well, perhaps it was a dodgy batch anyway. Maybe I would have got food poisoning or something from it. But this exercise kind of allowed me to kind of let it go. And I think that's partly, what this process is doing here. But it allowed me to accept that, accept the feeling, accept the situation. And I chose that one because it's a silly thing. It's like I felt bad about it. I don't know if it resonates with you. Please tell me if I'm crazy. I don't know if it resonates with you, but it was just a small, something which was worthless, but something which was like, annoying. So yeah, I'm probably not gonna go back to that car wash, but I'm not sure just yet. We'll see. I need to find if you know a better car wash, please tell me. Okay, so let's move on to the next one, abiding conditions, Chidekel. So Rabbi Nachman of Breslov had a famous saying. You might be familiar with it. All the world's a very narrow bridge, and the main thing is not to be afraid at all. This is a classic Hasidic idea. It's found all over the place. The founder of Hasidism and the great-grandfather of Rabbi Nachman, Baal Shem Tov, was profoundly moved by his father's dying words to him as a child. His father said to him that he should never fear anything in the world. And it was these words that carried him through life. And I strongly believe that it was this idea that actually made him into who he was. So for the Ishbitsarabi also, so we have a story about the son of the Ishbitsarabi, whom a similar situation took place with the grandson of the son. So he was the great grandson of the Ishbitsarabi. The same situation. His father, he was afraid of the dark, and he went to his grandfather, and his grandfather took him out in the night into the forest and said to him, you must never be afraid of anything in the world. The same teaching. And I really think this is kind of one of the things about Hasidism, which is why I love Hasidism. I think it's a great thing. So for the Ishbitsarabi also, this is what he refers to as the path of great doubt. So he says that Chidekel is a place of uncertainty. I don't know what's coming. I don't know whether it's going to be good or whether it's going to be bad. And in that place, there is fear. But what this great doubt does, though, is bring us into the moment. It forces us into being in the present moment and being with things as they are, whether they're good or whether they're bad. And it's also precisely the fourth grade of Abraham Maimonides. So it's exactly that same definition of it. So abiding conditions is this ability to remain steadfast in uncertainty, overcoming fear with equanimity and acceptance, come what may. So I have so at the beginning I said gutfulness. I have another word for it, and that's posture. So my wife originally, we were speaking about spiritual practice, and she said, what do you think I should do? And I said, you should learn something every day. You should pray every day, or do some kind of spiritual connection every day. And you should do some kind of physical activity every day. And so she came up with this alliteration, posture, parasha, prayer, which I think is really lovely. This idea of posture, again, for me, it developed into something else. And there are actually 4 types of posture. There's lying down, there's sitting, there's standing, and there's walking. So I think these are 4 types of faith-based activity. Lying down means just accepting whatever comes. So this is this practice. Sitting down means deliberation. In Hebrew, yeshiva is the name we give to the place of learning. So sitting is a place where you deliberate and think. You don't necessarily lie down and let things happen. You don't necessarily do anything about it. You just sit and kind of wait. Then there is standing, and standing is, again, these words, they have meaning, and we see them in the Rambam. Even has a chapter on his Guide for the Perplexed on meaning of standing. So standing means being steadfast, like we saw in the quotation from that God said to the people, be steadfast, wait and see God's salvation. So that's kind of when suffering comes. So that's kind of like standing is acceptance of suffering, or some kind of being strong in your position without budging in that thing. And the final one is walking. So for me, walking is Abraham Avinu is that paradigm of walking. God says to him, Lech lecha, walk for yourself. And what that means is go into uncertainty. God tells him, go. I don't know where you're going. I'm not telling you where you're going. I just want you to go. This is such a powerful, for me, that's the most powerful way of movement, of faith, to go somewhere and you don't know what's coming. You don't know, you've never been there before. You don't know where you are. And I feel like Abraham is kind of this model for us for that. There is another one actually. There's a story in Exodus where Moses, where the revelation there's this thunder and lightning and the cloud and fire, and the people are afraid. It says that people are afraid and they stood afar. But then it follows on. The following verse says, and Moses went into the fog, because that's where God is. right? That, for me, that's just a powerful expression of this idea of faith and how we implement it and what it means. So the people were too afraid and they stood back, but Moses knew that God was in that place of darkness. And he had the courage to go into that place of darkness. And when he and in that place he found God. So that's abiding conditions, moving within great doubt. So the final one we're going to look at today, and then we'll do some practice. We'll look at Pirat. So Pirat here I've put as seeking nothing. These four rivers are all modes of faith, and therefore all reflect differing approaches to loss and gain. We said that faith is about loss and gain. The third river faces craving directly. So the idea of non-gaining had a profound effect on me when I first encountered it. It says that we are all inherently pure and living within abundance. Whatever we need, we are always already receiving. To quote the lyrics from a song I used to listen to, every time I try to go where I really want to be, it's already where I am, because I'm already there. This idea of already there shows up in relation to prophecy. In the account of the chariot, it's referred to as the Maaseh Merkavah, in the first chapter of Ezekiel, it says Ezekiel was standing in the river Kevar, which literally means the river of already. The Zohar says this is the river of fire. So the Tikkun Zohar says this is the river of fire, i.e. the Milky Way was referred to as the river of fire, which flowed from ancient times. So the idea that it was already there from ancient times. The galaxy outside our solar system, due to its distance, appears to us as stationary, as though it was always there. Hence, it was called in medieval times the sphere of the fixed stars. So the zodiac, a fixed star, they're always there. They don't change. It appears that they don't change. So for the prophet, the encounter with God is an encounter with something that does not change, something outside of time, and therefore outside of gain and loss. Gain and loss is only meaningful within time. So seeking nothing as a practice is drawing from our own place, inner place of permanence. It may seem scary or contrived, but I really encourage you to reflect on it. And actually, I would like to end with some practice on it. Beforehand, do I have any questions or any comments? Okay, so let's get comfortable, and we'll do 5 or 10 minutes or something like that, and we'll do on this seeking nothing or non-gaining idea. So try to be comfortable, and if you are sleepy, are you unshared my screen? Thank you. I'm going to go into gallery view so I can see you. So I'm going to paraphrase one of my teacher's teacher, for whom the practice of non-gaining and non-seeking was central. When we sit in meditation, we are not sitting in order to gain something new. We are sitting in order to express what we already have. When we give up our ideas of gaining and accept things as it is, our sitting becomes the universe sitting, the universe expressing itself. That is why we sit in meditation. I'll repeat that. We don't sit meditation in order to gain something new. We are sitting in order to express what we already have. When we give up our ideas of gaining and accept things as it is, our sitting becomes the universe sitting, the universe expressing itself. That is why we sit in meditation. So let's take that with us. So let's sit for 10 minutes without any sense of gaining anything. We're not sitting to achieve something. We have no needs. We're just expressing ourselves. We're just being who we are, fully and completely. So there's no expectation. You're just receiving from the world as well. And we'll guide you a little bit in it. You can stay in meditation. Yeah, thank you for coming. And we'll come to a close there. If you want to ask a question, I love that Yiska joined us. I think children embody this idea. They have wants and needs and desires, but they also express this idea of just curiosity and true non-seeking, being there, curious and interested.
Well, we were delighted to share this with you, so thank you very much, Rabbi Gigi. Say thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll hand it back over to you, Rabbi Landau, and look forward to seeing you all in 2 weeks' time. I hope you have a nice Shavuot. Nice Shabbat.
Thank you, Shabbat Shalom, and good Yom Tov, everybody, and see you soon. Everyone should be well.
Thank you. Have a lovely Yom Tov and Shabbat Shalom.
Yeah.